Good afternoon, or good morning, depending on when you watch this. Welcome to the Go Create and Escalate Grant Application Overview webinar, which we're recording on the 11th of September 2020. I'm James Rule. I'm a consultant acting as the compliance manager for OxLEP, so I'm responsible for ensuring that the processes are followed correctly and that the ERDF, European Regional Development Fund projects spend and are delivered in a compliant manner. We are doing these webinars slightly differently from the grant application webinars that we've done before, because we've separated out the program specific elements from a more generic overview. This is the generic overview, and we will cover eligibility, which is the same across all of the different programs, how you apply, which is the same, the rules for ERDF funded grants under ISFB, Innovation Support for Business, the Go Create grant scheme, and the Escalate grant scheme. The key dates, and we're still running the accelerated process, and then I'm going to cover why applications are unsuccessful. We're not going to obviously have a live question answer session, but any questions, please email to business@oxfordshirelep.com and we will respond to them and provide updated Q&As for the grants on the website. So as I've said, the specific details on ISFB and Escalate grants will be available in separate webinar recordings to cover each of the schemes. So if you want a Go Create ISFB grant, please have a look at the shorter ISFB Go Create recording. If you want an Escalate grant, please have a look at that scheme. Guidance notes have been published for each of the ISFB and Escalate schemes. So you've got ISFB Go Create grant guidance, you have Escalate grants for purposeful and social enterprises, that's businesses for social good, and we have Escalate grants for other enterprises and scale up access to finance. So who is OxLEP? We're the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership, one of a network of local enterprise partnerships across the country. We're responsible for supporting and promoting the area and economic growth, and we provide through the OxLEP Business part of the organisation the Growth Hub programme for Oxfordshire. Now that is a one-stop shop for business support for any business within Oxfordshire. Part of the Growth Hub are the European Regional Development Fund projects, so Innovation Support Business and Escalate, but there's far more to the Growth Hub offer than just that. So please have a look at the OxLEP website, the OxLEP Business pages and the Growth Hub pages, and if you're not already linked into the Growth Hub, please make contact. So first of all, we're going to cover who is eligible for the grants. These grants under both ISFB and Escalate are aimed at SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. So what makes you an SME? You have to have less than 250 employees. You cannot be more than 25% owned by any organisation that is not itself an SME. And you need a turnover of less than 50 million euros and or a balance sheet of less than 43 million euros. So 3 out of those criteria are numbers. You either are or you are not. The 25% ownership issue is a complicated area because there are exceptions. So the primary example of an exception is if a venture capital firm happens to own 30% of your business, they will not count, regardless as to what size they are. They do not count towards your ownership status. So there are some very specific exemptions that mean that even if you have owners who are more than 25% owners of the business, you may still qualify as an SME. This can get fairly complicated because it effectively boils down to questions about controlling interests, who has control over the business. If in doubt, please ask the team. That's a recurring theme throughout all of my webinars on grant schemes. If in doubt, contact the team and ask. We're here to help. One thing we cannot support are what's known as undertakings in difficulty. Now, the first thing to note is the exception. If you are less than 3 years old, it doesn't matter. You can't qualify as an undertaking in difficulty, so we can support you whatever your financial status. However, if you are more than 3 years old, then you qualify as an undertaking in difficulty if you're an undertaking, so an SME, that effectively has lost more than half of your share capital as a result of accumulated losses. Now that's for limited liability companies or unlimited liability companies. So effectively, when you set the business up, you set your share capital. If more than half of that capital has disappeared as a result of accumulated losses, we're not able to support you. The point at which we check that is the 31st of December 2019. It used to relate to the year-end accounts of your last financial year, but the impact of COVID-19 means that the rules governing that have been changed, so that as long as you can demonstrate you were not an undertaking in difficulty as of the 31st of December 2019, then we can support you. The other things that would make you an undertaking in difficulty are that you're subject to insolvency proceedings, which I think is a fairly straightforward definition, or that you've been in receipt of rescue or restructuring state aid. If you've received that, you will know. Now, the table that gives an illustration at the bottom of the slide shows capital setups for various different businesses. Doesn't really matter what type of business. And then it shows some accumulated losses. So if you have £10,000 of capital, no accumulated losses, you're not an undertaking in difficulty. Similarly, if you have £10,000 of capital, £5,001 of accumulated losses set against that capital, you are an undertaking in difficulty, because more than half of your subscribed share capital has disappeared as a result of accumulated losses. Now, for certain types of business, where, for example, you have a very small share capital, or you may not have a share capital at all, this means that any accumulated losses, as per the last line on the spreadsheet, can lead to you failing the undertaking difficulty test. If you are in any doubt, please contact the team and please ask. Our aim is to help with this in any way that we can, and we do appreciate that this is a complicated area. Nevertheless, it is a fairly simple calculation. The self-declaration that you are not an undertaking in difficulty, you will already have completed both for ISFB and Escalate when you sign in. But it's worth to note that we are obliged to formally check, if you're applying for more than £50,000 of aid, whether or not you're an undertaking in difficulty. Otherwise, we're allowed to carry out just random spot checks. If in any doubt after speaking to us, speak to your accountant. And my handy, useful mathematical formula for working it out is capital plus your accumulated profits or losses has to be greater than or equal to original capital divided by 2. I promise that's the last time I do a written formula like that. So what are the key eligibility issues across all of the grant schemes that we run under ERDF programs? You cannot include staff costs, okay? So that includes direct employees, apprentices, interns, any staff cost that you incur. If you procure a consultant to deliver some work for you, that is not a staff cost, that is a consultancy cost, and that is eligible. Effectively, if someone is on your payroll, if somebody is attracting national insurance or pension costs, they are not going to be eligible costs for any of the ERDF grant schemes, either Escalate or Go Create. VAT costs can be included only if you're not registered for VAT, or if you cannot recover the VAT from HMRC. Now, we are not VAT experts, and we strongly recommend that you seek advice from your accountant about VAT before including or excluding it from your grant applications. The critical thing here is that any VAT that is included within your grant costs only gets covered once. So it is only repaid once, either through the grant or through HMRC. If you can recover your VAT from HMRC and you include it in your grant costs, you are recovering that VAT twice from the public sector, and that is not eligible. We require a clear and transparent audit trail for procurement, and we require 3 quotes for items that cost less than £24,999. So for anything up to that point, we would expect you to provide 3 written quotes. Clearly, if you're buying a variety of things that cost around about £10 each, we are not necessarily going to require you to seek 3 written quotes for each £10 item. That would be slightly ridiculous for you. At the same time, if we see a grant application that includes nothing other than £10 items that gets us up to £15,000–20,000, it will not be approved, because that will be deemed to be circumventing the procurement rules. Should your project, and this is particularly in the case of the Go Create grants, result in a procurement for anything over £24,999, you must run an open and competitive procurement process. We will take you through that. The requirement at the application stage is that you acknowledge that this is required and set out at a high level how you will achieve an open and competitive procurement. In short, the requirements are a clear advert both on your website and on the government's contracts finder website, because this is public money, a formal specification setting out the goods or services that you're looking to buy, and then a scoring of responses in line with the criteria that you set in the specification, so that we can demonstrate it's a fair and transparent process. And that should, I suppose it goes without saying, but it may not, also include things like the ERDF logo on your specification. One issue that does come up every so often are where you run a procurement process or you seek 3 quotes and the supplier that you select is already involved in your business. Okay, so you already work with, I don't know, a certain marketing company because they best fit your needs. You seek 3 written quotes for some different marketing activity, which is the subject of your grant application. And it happens that your existing supplier provides the best fit, and they're the ones that you select. That is acceptable. It is not a problem, provided that you can demonstrate a clear and robust justification for the selected supplier that isn't just because we already work with them, and provided that that supplier does not have any advantage in the procurement process. So, for example, if you have a project manager whom you have procured and who works for your business and who has helped you to draft the grant application for either Go Create or Escalate, you cannot use that project manager to run the procurement, sorry, the 3 written quote or the open procurement process if that provider is going to bid into it. Okay, there's got to be some clear blue water, terrible phrase for which I apologize, between anyone who could be deemed to have an advantage and the process that you as a business run to select the supplier. Key eligibility issue we often come up with is around defrayal. We do require defrayal evidence, and that at its most basic is a copy of a bank statement proving that you've made the payment to the supplier that is requested by their invoice. Now, it is perfectly permissible to pay suppliers using credit cards. There is no issue with that. However, under ERDF rules, that is not deemed to be defrayed until the point at which you have paid off the credit card from your bank account. So when you submit the claim to us, we will need to see not only the original invoice from the supplier, not only the credit card statement, redacted if necessary, showing that payment to the supplier, but also a copy of your bank account showing a payment from that bank account to the credit card for at least the value of the amount that you are claiming. So you have to be able to demonstrate that you have paid off out of your bank account at least the same amount as is being included in the claim. In some instances, people have received invoices from overseas suppliers and paid them in the relevant currency from an overseas bank account. Please don't. This is problematic for us, and it is problematic in terms of the evidence. Where you make a payment from an overseas bank account, let's say you have a supplier in France and you have a bank account in France, both of those accounts will be denominated in euros. The invoice will come in euros, the cost will go out of the bank account in euros. You can demonstrate the defrayal. What you cannot demonstrate is the exchange rate between euros and pounds that you are using to cover that transaction. Now, it is a small variance, but it's one of those things that can seriously hold up a claim, because we have to establish the point at which we should be translating the euro value into sterling. And if you have a large invoice, the value can vary between the date of invoice, the date it's paid from the overseas bank account, and the date at which you're claiming it. There can be quite a significant difference. If you are going to make payments to overseas suppliers in their domestic currency, it is far better to pay it from a UK bank account. If you do that, the defrayal evidence from the UK bank account will show you the euro exchange rate and any fees. It is very difficult for an auditor to object to that, because the audit trail is extremely clear. The transaction will actually say what the exchange rate was, and you will have a very clear sterling figure that you can put into your claim. There is a difference under ERDF rules between revenue and capital costs. So any individual item that costs less than £4,999, excluding VAT, under ERDF rules is a revenue cost. Okay, so where you are looking at revenue grants, and each of the different grant schemes will be very clear about whether they include capital or revenue costs. Anything less than £4,999 is revenue. However, any individual item, and we're talking here about tangible things, laptops, which is not a very good example, but any piece of kit that costs more than £1,000 but less than £4,999, excluding VAT, is classed as what they call a mobile asset. Effectively, it is a small asset. Now, a mobile asset, while it is an acceptable revenue cost, it has to be recorded in each project's asset register. So each project maintains an asset register that sets out all of the assets that have been purchased with ERDF money under that project. And it will include the name of the asset, a description of the asset, location of the asset, depreciation terms for that asset, because the requirement is that if an ERDF project purchases an asset, it must be used for the purpose for which it was purchased until it has been fully depreciated. So if you buy, I'll use a laptop again, much as I dislike using them as an example. If you buy a laptop as part of your grant application, we will require the model details, the registration number of the laptop, photos of the thing. The auditors like to see the photos in place with an asset label on it, preferably with an ERDF logo somewhere nearby, but that can be difficult to arrange. And if you say that you will depreciate that laptop over 3 years, you cannot sell or otherwise dispose of that laptop until the 3 years are up. Now, you should depreciate over exactly the same term as all of your standard depreciation treatments. I've come across businesses that depreciate things over 12 months, others over 2 years, some over 3 years. I've come across some businesses that consider items under a certain value to be depreciated on the day that they're delivered, because they would argue there's no real resale cost. We don't put any requirements on your depreciation process and policy, but we do ask that you use a consistent one. You cannot depreciate anything you buy over 3 years, but anything bought with a grant over 6 months, that's not acceptable. So then all of that covers revenue items, so mobile assets. Any item that costs more than £5,000 excluding VAT is a capital item. All of the requirements about asset registers that I've spoken about will apply, but these sort of costs can only be included if the grant scheme that you're applying against explicitly allows for capital spend. Okay, and the guidance for the specific schemes will make that very clear. So things that we can't fund. We've talked about salary costs and staff costs. We cannot fund that. We can't fund travel and expenses, nor can we fund VAT payments you can recover from HMRC. So it then becomes a little bit more esoteric. We cannot cover any other debt or refinancing costs. So if you purchase something on hire purchase, for example, where part of your monthly payment is effectively an interest cost on a debt that you've taken out, that is not eligible. Hire purchase is not eligible. We also cannot cover any statutory or legislative requirements. So what do we mean by that? If a business needs accountancy support, that is an eligible cost, but it is not an eligible cost if that accountancy support is to complete your financial year accounts for submission to Companies House, because that is a legislative requirement. That is something that you have to do. Now, it is somewhat wider than that. So if you are manufacturing some kind of widget and there's a quality standard that you would like to obtain that would help you to sell more of them, that is an eligible cost. But the same manufacturer who has a quality standard that they must adhere to in order to sell their widget, that is not an eligible cost because it is a legal requirement on them to be in order to sell the widget. We cannot fund training. Now that is because ERDF is the business support element of European funding. European Social Fund is the training, the people-focused funding scheme. That, however, does not include things like leadership and management development. So things like mentoring, if you wanted to procure some mentoring support for your management team, that is acceptable. The shorthand for this is whether or not it leads to some kind of qualification or accreditation. If you do the course and you get credits towards a qualification, or you come away with a qualification, it is very unlikely to be eligible under ERDF. Please don't buy any vehicles. Purchase of vehicles is not eligible under ERDF, and I've talked a bit about hire purchase arrangements. Seriously, really, please don't buy vehicles. I do put that in there twice deliberately because it is something that auditors coming to look at projects in Oxfordshire do check for. It's something from one of the old ERDF programmes where a project had a spend shortfall, decided that quite an effective way to make that shortfall up was to go out and buy a car. The auditor, and it is frequently the same auditor, found this in a claim that they came out to audit, and there was a fairly large financial correction levied. Please don't buy any vehicles. We can't cover like for like or routine replacement or any kind of preventative or remedial maintenance. So what we mean by that is I have a machine, it's wearing out or it needs a service in order to keep it running. That's not eligible. If you have a machine that is wearing out and that you've decided to replace with a different model that allows you to make whatever it is that you make twice as quickly, or to make additional product lines with it, that is acceptable because that is not a routine replacement, it is not a like-for-like replacement, and it's not remedial maintenance, it's not putting it back. What the rules are saying there is effectively that when you're using the grant money, there must be an improvement, there must be an additional benefit that you gain from the grant money. You must move forward with it rather than standing still. We cannot build or refurbish retail facilities, which is just a slightly odd rule that's in there. And there are some very specific sectors that we cannot support. So we can't support the primary production of agricultural goods and fisheries or aquaculture. So effectively farms and market gardens or fish farms are not eligible for support. There are other European funding streams that would support those. It is worth saying that primary production is an interesting definition when you actually dig into it. Within the guidance notes, there are some instructions on how you can establish whether you are subject to the primary production rule. We have come across one or two businesses that do fall foul of it, but the vast majority don't necessarily fall foul of it. So if in doubt, again, ask us, we can advise. We can't support the road freight sector. We can't support services of general economic interest. When this was a live version, I used to do a prize for anyone who actually knew what that meant. It's organisations like OxLEP, so business support, business development organisations like us that are publicly funded. It also covers things like the National Health Service or generalised schooling. We cannot support export related activities. Now that does not mean that we are unable to support you to develop products that you then export. Of course we can. What it does mean is that we cannot help you to set up an export supply chain. So we couldn't help you to make specific arrangements to export your products. Similarly, we can't support activities that favour domestic over imported goods. So this all relates back to competition law. If your activities will only be carried out because you refuse to use overseas suppliers, it's not something that we can support. There are some deliverables that we must report against all of the grant schemes that we run. Some of them very straightforward, others slightly less so. We report the grant that we've given you. That's easy. We know how much that is because we paid it to you. We report the match that you have provided against the grant. Again, we know how much that is because when you put your grant claim into us, you have to match the whole of the expenditure. So even if your grant only covers 50% of your total costs, the evidence that you need to provide to us must cover 100% of the costs. We report on new jobs created, so employment increase. We report on new products that you've introduced either to the firm or to the marketplace. And we report on new businesses that we have supported. So that is any business that we support that is less than 12 months old when it joins the programme. That's fine. We will know who you are. For all of these, evidence is needed. And as you might expect a compliance person to say, there's a form for these. And you will see them as you go through the grant process. If you're successful and receive a grant offer letter, we will take you through all of the forms that are needed in order to demonstrate the deliverables. So how do you go about applying? The first thing is to read the guidance on the website if you haven't done already, and to watch all of the relevant videos and webinars that are on there. Speak to the relevant project team, fill out the application forms that we've provided, and please use the checklist. It's a very useful way to double check that you've completed everything that you need to complete in the form. I know it is, I wrote it. And then once you've submitted before the deadline, wait and see. We will keep you posted and we will tell you what the outcome has been. As I mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation, we're running now an accelerated process compared to the one that we used to run in pre-COVID-19 days. So we will aim to review applications that we receive twice monthly, and we have a cut-off date at midday on the first and third Friday of the month. So at the point of recording this, the next cut-off date is the 18th of September at midday, that's a Friday, and everyone will be notified by the 8th of October. The subsequent cut-off date is the 2nd of October, midday, another Friday. Aim to notify everybody by the 23rd of October, and so on and so forth. It is worth reiterating for those who attended one of the earlier webinars in previous years that at the moment we are still unable to offer the soft check proofreading service that we've done in earlier rounds. We still haven't got the capacity to do that. And what are the rules that govern the funding? I've talked about bank statements and defrayal. It is very important to remember that we can only reimburse against defrayed expenditure, so money that has left your bank account, that you incur after the date of the grant offer letter. If you pay for things before you have a grant offer letter, before effectively the start date of the project, an auditor would say, well, they didn't need the grant, did they? Because they were willing to pay for it anyway. Please follow the procurement rules. Where we say 3 quotes are required, we do mean 3 quotes are required. If 3 quotes are impossible, and the more I deliver this webinar and the more grant applications I see, the more irritated I become at the fact that actually there are a couple of exceptions to this. I used to say that it would be almost impossible to convince me that there weren't exceptions. Unfortunately, nowadays there are. The obvious one being I've identified that a Facebook advertising campaign is the most effective way to market my product, and I need a grant to help me pay for that. Your quote will be from Facebook, because Facebook is the place that you do a Facebook advertising campaign on. In that case, there isn't really a way that you can get 3 other quotes. If it's impossible to get 3 quotes, please explain that to us and explain why. In an ideal world, if it's only going to be possible to get a single quote, you will have an email from 2 other potential suppliers that say, we can't possibly quote for this. The only people we know of who might do it are the people who've provided you with the 1 quote you've got. I'm well aware that life doesn't work like that, but I live in hope that one day something that clear and that straightforward will come in. The critical thing for all of this is that evidence is key. Evidence for what you've done, how you've done it, and what you've spent. So at this point, I would usually ask a responsive audience whether they think we're being flexible or rigid. And the answer is that we're as flexible as we can be within a fairly rigid framework. So now I'm going to cover what is the main second part of the presentation, which is why our application's unsuccessful. Anyone who has reviewed earlier versions of this webinar or attended the live version back when we were running them, this hasn't changed, so you can stop here or jump on to the end of the presentation. I deliberately present on why applications are unsuccessful rather than why applications are successful, or how to make an application successful, because this is a competitive process. It is entirely possible that you can follow every bit of advice that I give and still be unsuccessful. It is competitive. That doesn't mean that there was anything necessarily wrong with your application. It just means that others were better, or stronger, or delivered more. Excuse me. So the first thing is to consider length. Think Goldilocks. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that the length of your application should be neither too long nor too short. In some instances, we will provide specific word limits on answers. If we do that, please stick to them. If you provide more words than the word limit allows, we will not read them, we will not assess them. And just as importantly, word limits where they're provided are not a target. If you can provide your grant application response in fewer words than the word limit, that's not a problem. Where we don't provide a word limit, if you've written 6 pages, you will almost certainly have written too much. If you've written 2 paragraphs, you will almost certainly have written too little. Okay, it needs to be just right, going back to the Goldilocks analogy. It needs to tell us everything that we need to know and that you think we need to know to assess the application fairly, but not so much detail that the assessors are confused and lost. Don't be obtuse. Keep it clear and simple, and don't use long, complicated words like obtuse. Okay? Clarity and simplicity are best to ensure that it is easy to follow for the people who are scoring it and reading it, so that they don't get confused, they don't get lost. Please review the style. And what I mean by that is that things like spell checker is there for a reason. No application will be failed on the basis of spelling mistakes. But if an application is full of spelling mistakes, it becomes very difficult to read. And whether we like it or not, the people who are scoring, the people who are assessing the applications are only human. And it will put the thought in the back of their mind that there could be a risk with this application. The attention to detail is not very strong. Please make sure that the applications are good quality. Please take your time when you're drafting them. If you start drafting your application 24 or 48 hours before it is due, you are almost certainly drafting them too late. The checking service, I'm afraid I've mentioned, is something we can't offer at the moment. And please be consistent all the way through the application. If you have requested a grant of £15,000 on page 1, please ensure that you're still requesting a grant of £15,000 on page 10. Again, it's not something we will necessarily fail an application on, but it does raise questions about the quality and the attention to detail that's in there. Please make sure you complete everything. Leaving a box blank is a frequent reason for applications to be unsuccessful. When you look back through, think if a box is left blank, could you put not applicable in that box and have it still make sense? If the form doesn't make sense, please fill the box in. So, for example, not applicable in the boxes that would ask you about a parent company in the original application form makes perfect sense if you don't have a parent company. Not applicable in the box that asks you about your number of employees does not make sense. Even if the answer is 0, the answer to that question is a number. In terms of the content of your application, a lot of people assume prior knowledge. It's very easy to do because you are so close to your technologies. You live and breathe it every day. You know your business, you know your project, you know exactly what you want to do. The people scoring and reviewing your applications will not. If you find yourself thinking, it goes without saying that, it never does. If you assume that somebody reading your application will have some prior knowledge, some background knowledge, at some point you will come across somebody who does not have that knowledge. When you're structuring the applications, please start at the beginning, go on to the middle and finish at the end. So what do I mean by that? You're giving it an introduction, you're giving it a main body, a description of what you want to do, and you're finishing at the end. What is the impact? So this is my business, this is where I've come from, this is what it does, this is what I want to do with the grant, and this is the impact that it will have on me. You are setting out, as I say below, a story. You're telling us what we need to know. Please ensure that the content is relevant. It is very tempting to provide an awful lot of highly technical detail on either an IT system or a medical innovation, whatever it may be. Please tell us only what we need to know to assess it. If you provide too much detail, if it's not relevant detail, you risk confusing the assessors. And this then links to the last bullet on the page about using attachments and additional documents. We've left the option for you to provide additional attachments and documents with your application. Please use this within reason. If you attach a 3-page additional attachment, then it's highly likely that somebody scoring your application will look through it. If you provide a 300-page attachment, it is highly likely that they will not read it. If you must attach something large to your application, the best thing to do is to reference it within the text of the application. So for more details on whatever it may be, please see attachment A, pages 23 to 25 or 23 to 24, whatever it is. Make it clear and lead the person scoring the application directly to the relevant part of the attachments. Ideally, applications should stand on their own and shouldn't rely on people looking things up in attachments. but we do appreciate that that isn't always possible. In terms of the process, we have a couple of three-letter acronyms to start. RTQ, read the question. We do set out quite a lot of guidance on the question for what we're looking for, so please make sure that you've read and thought through the question. The example I always use here actually goes back to my school days, which is quite a long time ago now. I had a history teacher who used to tell the story about how in her final exams at university, she had written the best ever essay that she had ever written in her life about 18th century France. And she had 5 minutes left at the end of the exam, and she looked back at the question and realised that she should have written it on 17th century France. Please make sure that you take the time to read and think through the questions that we're asking. And then once you've done that, ATQ, answer the question. And this links back to the relevance of the content that you're providing and the level of detail that you're providing. The questions that we've asked are the things that people are going to score your response on. The more clearly that you can answer those questions, the easier it is for assessors to score in a meaningful and hopefully a high fashion. 3 quotes means 3 quotes. If you find that you get to 11 o'clock on deadline day and somebody hasn't returned your 3rd quote, you can submit. Please explain that in an email or the application if you have time to edit it, but that quote will then follow when it's received. If you just submit with only 1 out of 3 quotes and no explanation or acknowledgement that 2 of them are missing, that then is going to result in a significant query as you go through the process. And as I've said before, if it really is impossible, then you will have confirmation from companies that they can't quote. If you find yourself saying things like, but I'm different, or we've worked with them before, well, companies are not that different. And if you've worked with them before, that is exactly the point about an open and transparent competition. This is public money that's being given out, and we need to ensure that it is distributed and used fairly and transparently. So when you have a grant, as I've mentioned earlier, please wait until the grant has actually been awarded before spending or entering into any contracts to spend. Please then actually spend it, even without the impact of COVID-19 on businesses. It never ceased to surprise me how many businesses would actually not then spend the grant money. And what was always slightly more surprising to me is that those who did sometimes wouldn't then claim it back. If you don't submit the claim to the relevant project team, we're not going to be able to reimburse the grant. If you haven't claimed it, we can't pay it out. And since you have to cash flow these because you have to defray the expenditure before you can recover the grant money, it is in your interests to get that claim into us as soon as you can. Having said that, we do understand that there will be delays in grant projects. There often are, for a variety of different reasons. If so, please tell us, contact the team. If we know that a claim is going to be delayed, we can manage that internally. And we can manage that with the funding body. Just as I've said before, speak to the team. Please ensure that when you put the claim in, you provide the necessary evidence with your claim. Now, at its most basic, that will be a copy of an invoice from one of the suppliers that you've selected within your grant application, and then a copy of a bank statement demonstrating that you've made that payment for that amount to that supplier. Things become far more complicated if you make multiple payments or sorry, if you pay multiple invoices in a single payment, and only some of those invoices relate to activity within the claim. If you do that, you will need to provide us with evidence for the breakdown so that we can track the figure from the invoice through the process and link it to an amount that's been defrayed, an amount that you've spent. And critically, if something's going to be different, if anything changes, if a supplier changes for whatever reason, please let us know. Highlight it in the claim, but ideally let us know before the claim comes in. This is not a situation in which it is easier to seek forgiveness than permission. If you keep us informed, if you let us know what's happening and what may or may not change, it is much easier when the claims come in for us to approve them and turn them around and get them paid, get you reimbursed quickly. So for more information, you're welcome to watch this webinar again if you can stand it. You can watch the specific programme presentations, which will also be on the same website. And the slides and the guidance notes are all published on the OxLEP website as well. There are some FAQs up there, which include additional questions that have been asked since the grant schemes first launched. And as questions come into us, we will update and republish the Q&A document. To be fair, it went fairly quiet over the summer, and I don't think it has been updated at the point of recording this for at least a month. But it is always worth checking quite regularly because we will update it when new questions come in. Please email your questions to business@oxfordshirelep.com, and please try and avoid questions that include anything that is commercially confidential. Part of the requirement for running an open and competitive grant process is that we make the same information available to all applicants for the grants. Therefore, please do not include anything in your questions that is commercially confidential. Try and keep them generic. We will, of course, edit them before they're published to ensure that we don't share anything that is commercially confidential. But you should be aware that if you ask a question, then if that question is not already covered elsewhere, we will be publishing it as part of the frequently asked questions document. So that is the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening. I suggest you have a break before you move to the program specific presentation, either for Go Create ISFB or for Escalate. But I hope this has been useful. Thank you very much.